He was named in a brutality lawsuit. He shot and critically wounded a man after a brief and nonviolent confrontation. Mr. Floyd, how did you feel when you learned about Officer Chauvin's history of misconduct?
He should have been off the force. Any officer committing an act like that shouldn't be able to get a job in any county after they get fired. The guy, they had enough evidence to sit there and fire them, but they didn't have enough evidence to arrest them. I'm not understanding that.
Ms. Gupta, does this make any sense? Should we keep police officers with long histories of misconduct complaints on patrol?
No, we shouldn't. It is why the Leadership Conference has pushed for the establishment of a national police misconduct registry. It's a national registry of all federal, state, and local law enforcement officials that would be created containing information on misconduct complaints, discipline, and termination records, and records of certification. I will tell you there's actually significant law enforcement support for this kind of registry, and prosecutors around the country have asked for this kind of registry. But chiefs in particular have said that this is a real problem when they don't have this kind of information when they're making hiring decisions.
And that's why we have the registry provision in the Policing and Justice bill that we're considering.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, Chief Acevedo, you manage a large urban police force. Are repeated misconduct complaints a red flag?
Yes, they are, Mr.
And what do you think we can do about that?
Well, we make it real clear to our officers that and our employees that none of them are cats, that you don't get 9 lives. And quite frankly, we use the tenets of progressive discipline. Sometimes labor will argue, why are you firing somebody if you believe in progressive discipline? And the answer is simple. If the crime or the policy violation supports termination, indefinite suspension, that's what we do, whether it's the first offense or the third offense. But a pattern of misconduct cannot be tolerated, should not be tolerated, and that's why it's important to also use the pattern of complaints, whether they're sustained or not sustained or unfounded, to look for any type of patterns of conduct to see if there's any commonality, to see if we need to take a deeper look at our employees.
And so you would think it a good idea to have a national registry so that one police department knew about the misconduct of an officer in a different police department before they hired him?
Well, you know, I can tell you on my individual capacity, Mr. Chairman, that I do support that concept. We've been, as an organization, very busy operationally in the last 2 weeks, and we're going to start having our deliberations on all these measures hopefully Friday. And we will come back with an official position. But I can tell you the individual chiefs that I know that I've spoken with absolutely support it. Having said that, even absent a national registry, it is incumbent upon hiring agencies to do thorough backgrounds. The internal affairs packages, complaint histories, everything's available at the previous employing histories, departments, pardon me. And so due diligence is important with or without a registry. But personally, I do support that concept.
Thank you. My time has expired. Mr. Gate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Floyd, I don't know that the cameras picked it up or saw it, but when Angela talked about her brother dying, I saw a physical reaction from you. I saw you lean over in your chair. I thought I noticed your body even tremble with empathy and care for Angela and her brother, Pat, who passed away. If you could say anything to the people who killed Pat, what would it be?
Life is precious. Everybody should be able to live and be able to walk this earth in a journey that they want to. Nobody should have to be filled with hatred and so much animosity that they want to kill somebody. Dr. King said a long time ago, he wanted everybody around the world to be able to join hands together. And I think right now, if he was here right now, he would understand that the world is united right now. and we all are coming together.
That is so powerful, and I deeply thank you for that. And I want to test that sense of unity. And Mr. Chairman, if we could get the witnesses who are joining remotely to be on the screen so we could see them. I have a question I would like to ask everyone, and I apologize for the crude nature in which I have to ask this, but there's just so many witnesses. If you believe that we should defund the police, will you please raise your hand? And yes, is there anyone on the, okay. So that's unifying and wonderful that here we are gathered. I'm sorry.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
I actually have an answer to that
well,
question.
I'm sure someone will be able to ask you that question, but I've limited time here. I didn't see anyone raise their hand to defund the police. I certainly didn't see any of the Republican witnesses do that. And so I'm going to now go through and see where that sentiment may have been reflected. Here's a tweet from two of our congressional colleagues supporting this group, Black Visions Minnesota. And then next, please. And then here's that group, that same group, Black Visions Minnesota, that my congressional colleagues are raising money for, saying that we should end the police. And can we go to the next one? And then here's that same organization retweeting rebel scum, abolish the police. And then here's the same group saying that instead of police, we need therapists, doctors, and street medics, not cops. Mr. Bongino, in your experience, every time someone calls 911, would a therapist or a medic be sufficient, or sometimes do people need cops?
I'm quite unclear how a medic is going to help with an armed subject who's assaulting his wife in a domestic violence situation or elsewhere. I'm not sure how that's going to be of any value.
And here again is that same group saying that we need lasers to disorient surveillance cameras, and we need water balloons filled with milk to throw at people. Again, this is the organization that my congressional colleagues are raising money to support. If we could go to the next one. And then here again, that same organization that multiple members of Congress are supporting, saying it's not enough to only abolish police or prisons. We need to abolish race, abolish ICE, abolish the military, abolish the state, abolish the borders. And again, this is what our colleagues are raising money for, and it's not just any member of Congress. It's actually one of our treasured colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, the gentlelady from Washington, raising money for this very same organization. Ms. Underwood-Jacobs, your brother is someone who was part of this law enforcement community when he gave his life. When you learn that my colleagues in Congress are raising money for an organization that promotes defunding the police, destroying our borders, defunding our military, and taking apart the state altogether, how does that make you feel?
Actually, I find that conduct to be deplorable. And we elect officials to represent everyone. And the idea to have our communities without protection and safety is wrong. So my response to that would be for people to get out and vote and get the right person in office to ensure that we feel protected and our children feel protected for generations to come.
I appreciate that greatly. Mr. Floyd, again, I appreciate your calls, not only today, but in the direct aftermath of your brother's killing. You showed grace and care for your fellow Americans. And I don't know if everyone is religious, but I do believe God is working through you to try to call us together. And finally, I wanted to thank Ms. Bass for the legislation she's introduced and that constellation of ideas. While I think that we can fine-tune elements to ensure that we don't defund the police, that we don't make our communities less safe, I do think there is not a legitimate defense of chokeholds or lynching or bad cops that get shuttled around, and you will be able to count on Republican cooperation as we hone these ideas and hopefully pass them and get them to the President's desk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me say what a transformational few weeks this has been since the murder of Mr. Floyd. I am grateful to my constituents and those around the country who have marched peacefully to raise the issue of justice in our country. I am grateful to Karen Bass and the Congressional Black Caucus, as well as you, Mr. Chairman, for your work in putting this bill together. I think it's important to state at the outset what this hearing is about and what it isn't about. It's really about this bill and how we can improve the state of policing in the United States. I've heard several people talk about funding for law enforcement. We did that when we passed the HEROES Act. We provided funds for local governments to address issues in their communities, whether it's health or public safety. And we all know that it is the local communities that organize their public safety response, not the federal government. However, when there are police, we want to make sure that those police operate in a legal way that doesn't use violence against people who pose no violent threat. And that's why I would like to ask Ms. Eiffel if she could address these two questions. First, we've incorporated the Peace Act into this bill, which basically outlines when the use of deadly force is appropriate. That, coupled with the new standard for unwillfulness that would provide accountability, is my question to you. Will those two measures help prevent violence against people who are not posing a violent threat?
Thank you very much, Representative Lofgren. And I, at some point, would love to and welcome the opportunity to talk about the funding issue, but let me answer the question that you asked. One of the principal problems that we have found in this long-standing systemic issue of police violence against unarmed African Americans is the inability to hold officers who engage in this conduct accountable. Now, this is not just about the individual officer who some refer to as a bad apple. This is about a system of accountability that must exist if police officers are to understand that they cannot engage in certain kinds of conduct without impunity. And unfortunately, all of the legal tools that are available to us to hold officers accountable have been weakened or lack the sufficient strength and language to allow us to do so. So strengthening the language of the federal criminal statute that will not hold us to such a high standard in proving intent of the officer's conduct is critical. And so adding a recklessness provision into that language that will allow us to get at some of this officer conduct is vitally important. What I suggested earlier, qualified immunity on the civil side, is vitally important to removing that defense to ensuring that we can hold officers accountable. I've spoken to many police officers about the culture of impunity around these killings and around these acts of brutality. And they know, just as anyone who is in a system knows, whether they are lawyers, whether they are doctors, whether they are police officers, that accountability is critical to influencing behavior. And unfortunately, our legal system has failed in providing that accountability. And what this bill tries to do is to go into those statutes where the language either isn't sufficiently strong or where courts have interpreted the language in such a way as to remove the power of the statute, to put the tools back into the hands of the Department of Justice, but also private attorneys and civil rights attorneys.
Thank you,
so
Ms.
that they
Eiffel.
can use the law to hold officers accountable.
Thank you very much. My time is just about expired. I just like to note that for many years, African Americans have been mistreated in many cases, in many communities by law enforcement. And the multi-ethnic, broad, peaceful protests that have arisen around our country that have been met also with violence, I think have opened the eyes of Americans across the United States about the need for reform. I think this is an important step forward, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. When I turned the TV on the day after Memorial Day and saw the brutal murder of George Floyd, it made me sick. And the depravity that was exhibited there, really burned in my soul. And I would like to say, Mr. Floyd, that, not only am I personally sad and express my condolences to you and your family, But the pain of your brother, I think, has become the pain of America. And it's up to us to constructively deal with this so that we can do more than just have a press release and make a difference. After your brother died, there were a lot of people who legitimately exercised their constitutional rights to peacefully protest. There were some who came in that didn't want to peacefully protest, and as a result, we had riots and arson and burning, and people, both protesters as well as police, became injured as a result of that. And that, in my opinion, ended up attempting to destroy the legacy of your brother. And the people who did decide to raise mayhem are going to have to account for that, sooner or later, whether it's in a court of law, or elsewhere. But I think we have to recognize one thing, and we've heard about this from some of the witnesses as well as in the news media, and that is that there are good cops and there are bad cops. And if the police end up being defunded, which I think would be a horrible idea, let's look at what the consequence will be. First of all, the consequence would be if there are no police, there'll be vigilantism. And I would submit to you that there will probably be more racism if people take the law into their own hands than if they relied on the police to investigate crimes and to protect the public. But the second thing is that it would hurt the good cops. 99% of the people who serve in law enforcement and put their lives on the line every day of the year are good cops. They want to enforce the law. They don't want to harm anybody, and they know that their job is to protect the public. And these are the cops, if money were taken away, that would end up either losing their job or not getting pay raises or maybe even getting pay cuts. And that would be a travesty of justice, in my opinion. Now, having said that, I want to turn to my Democratic colleagues. A lot of the police union activity that we have seen has been to protect bad cops. And the police unions in this country, and my Democratic colleagues, have more friends in those unions than we Republicans do, are going to have to step up to the plate and to be cooperative with communities in getting rid of the bad cops. I heard that George Floyd's assailant had 16 allegations of misconduct against him. Why was he still on the force? That was just, an invitation to more misconduct. And unfortunately, Mr. Floyd, your brother, ended up being the victim of that. So I would hope that as this debate goes on, we have speedier resolutions of getting rid of bad cops. I see nothing wrong with having, a bad cop database. But having a database isn't going to get somebody fired who ought to be fired. And the sooner we get the bad cops off the force, the sooner there will no longer be any bad apples to spoil the whole barrel. I look forward with working with all of you, but you guys over on the other side of the aisle and gals are going to have to be very proactive in telling police unions that it is in their interest and in the interest of the vast majority of their membership to get rid of bad cops. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the leadership and the leadership of this entire committee and, of course, the Congressional Black Caucus that we are privileged to work with. My very deep sympathy, Ms. Jacobs, to you. No one should die on the streets of this nation, and we thank you for your brother's service. Let me speak to my family and constituent from Houston to let you know that George Floyd, your brother, your big brother, should not have died on the streets of Minneapolis. He did not deserve to die. He was an innocent person. And the 8 minutes and 46 seconds which we knelt to reflect was so painfully long that the stain and the impact will be seared in our souls forever. You have to carry this in your heart. And so today, I think the good news is that the George Floyd Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Bill, already named, is incorporated in this bill. And the Justice and Policing Act is a legislative reconstruct to do what you've asked us to do what those who are on the streets, who are young and black and brown, white and Asian, who are crying out. And we need to hear them. And I want to say that I have heard them. So, Mr. Floyd, if you would, there are many things that you've said, and I believe in harmony. But do you believe that race impacted what happened to your brother?
I believe, yes, ma'am, I believe that. Because George, wherever he goes, he impacts a place. He talks to a lot of people. He's just a gentle giant. So at that club, and Mr. Chauvin worked there, I know that he knew him. Everybody knew him. The mayor knew him. Killed my brother just because he didn't like him, and it has to be racist. It has to be something to do with racism.
We must get rid of the stain of race. In this legislation is an emphasis on discerning what excessive force is, accreditation. Chief Acevedo, if you can emphasize the importance of having standards and accreditation of the huge numbers of police departments very quickly for us, please. Chief Acevedo, thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you for your leadership and for your advocacy in Washington. We have 18,000 police departments in this nation, with 18,000 sets of rules, policies, regulations, and 18,000 levels of accountability and training. We really believe, I believe, and I can tell you that I believe once we discuss this as a group with the major city chiefs, that we absolutely have to have national standards that list the critical policies, training regimens, and oversight. And so we are prepared to be part of that conversation. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Mr. Crump, you have seen a lot of these cases. You might very briefly for me indicate race, but holding police accountable, taking away this barrier of qualified immunity, but additionally getting back to consent decrees. If you could quickly respond to that, I have a question for Mr. Butler. But you, and let me thank you for being there from the litany of names, including Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin. We have been together, and there's a long list that I am not ignoring. Michael Brown, but thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership. To answer your question directly, immunity breeds impunity for these police. If they have this qualified immunity, we see no accountability. It allows for all those names, all those Black Lives Matter names to keep adding up. So we need that there. We need the registry. We need to attack this like it's an epidemic on black people, because that's what we see happening in our communities.
This is about misconduct, Professor Butler. I'm glad to be able to say that we know there are good police officers, but help us understand. Mr. Morial gave us a history of slavery and the stain of it. How much of that stain permeates into policing when they go into the African-American community and deal with African-American men? The mic.
Far too often, Congresswoman, officers view themselves as warriors, and it's almost as though the communities they serve experience them as occupying forces. You know, there's been so much attention to the pandemic and how we're going to find a treatment. For this epidemic of police violence, we already have a treatment. President Obama's Commission on 21st Century Policing recommended common sense reforms, many of which are contained in the Justice Act of 2020. So we don't have to reinvent anything. We know exactly what to do now to make police departments more accountable and transparent. The question is, will your colleagues have the will to implement these common sense measures?
Well, I believe
Gentlelady's
you can
time
change
has expired.
the policing, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
And I look forward to
Mr.
changing
Gomer?
the bill's name to George Floyd
Mr. Gomer.
bill. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, and appreciate all of you being here. No, it is very difficult, especially for those of you that have lost loved ones. You have our deepest sympathy, as do all of those families that have lost loved ones in the aftermath. This is a serious issue, and Mr. Floyd, it's a comfort to a lot of us, especially those of us who are Christians, to see the way in which you've carried yourself. You've asked for people to refrain from violence. We don't need it to lead to worse violence, but that was atrocious. It's just hard to watch the video and not feel great sympathy for your brother and great sympathy for you and your family. So it's nice when we get together and talk about potential solutions. Hopefully the majority will allow more input than the zero input we've had on the bill so far. But it also is important to look at different proposals. We've heard some say, on television, let's get rid of or defund the police, get rid of them. Some are saying, let's get rid of the qualified immunity that police have so they don't get sued by every single person they come in contact with. As a judge, I had judicial immunity. And the thing is, it's a qualified immunity, and it's not there if you're violating the law, and that's as it should be. But as we look at solutions, and it's been brought up by others, but the police unions have defended bad apples, and if you talk to police, if you know police, heard Dan Bongino talk about it, they know who the bad apples are, and most of them don't want to have anything to do with them. They don't want to be on patrol with them. They don't want to work with them. So how do we get rid of them? I personally have seen where you have a bad apple at the top, and some righteous whistleblower has retaliation against them, and the unions have come in and appropriately defended them. But when it comes to eliminating qualified immunity, I've seen what happened with teachers. I had a bill to eliminate or to create qualified immunity for teachers, educational immunity. And the teachers group never had got on board. I was told it was because they make so much money selling liability insurance to their members. And I'm afraid it might be a cash cow for the unions, but that's not what this needs to be about. Let me just ask you, Mr. Floyd, if somebody conspires to lynch somebody else, do you think a 10-year maximum sentence would be appropriate? No. You're shaking your head. Thank you.
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. Bobby Rush, he's a fine man, a just wonderful heart, good-hearted man. He had a bill that would make a life sentence if you conspire to participate. And I said, Bobby, it should be a life sentence. Why is it now 10-year max? And he said, well, I had it at life maximum sentence, but I was told if it was going to pass the House, it had to be brought down to 10 years. Well, I think that's an insult. And I know the Emmett Till bill is part of this overall bill, but I would hope we would come together and say, 10 years for conspiring to lynch is not an adequate maximum punishment. Maybe it needs to be lower in a given case, but let's have life in there as a penalty, and I would hope to see that. I know Chuck Colson once said, our hope in America will not arrive on Air Force One. And Pastor Scott, I have eminent respect for you. Where is your hope for America?
My hope for America is the Lord Jesus Christ. I believe that our country was founded on Christian principles, that we've invoked the name of God and the presence of God, and I believe the hand of God was upon this nation in its founding. Let me say this: when I saw the video of George Floyd,
remember the time of the member has expired. Mr.
Can he finish his answer?
Mr. Cohen.
I guess we'll have to have you do by video, and then you can just keep going.
Your mic.
Thank you. H.R. 7120 contains in it a change in qualified immunity, basically an elimination of qualified immunity, and that's important and it's good. Mr. Mosh got out front on that, and Mr. Nadler, Mr. Butterfield, and I had a bill on it too, and others. It's an important part of civil rights litigation, but the employer has to be made responsible as well, and because of that, I'm going to propose a bill to have respondeat superior relationship with the employer and make part of that reform that respondeat superior will apply to 1983 civil rights actions. Mr. Crump, your experience with civil rights actions, and I know you've got a lot, would having a respondeat superior relationship with the employer be effective in seeing that conduct that was improper was changed?
Absolutely. And also, I think qualified immunity, as I've said earlier, allows for police to act with impunity. I think there's a reason we see black men mostly, but also black women being killed by police over and over again, and nobody ever being held accountable, and either criminal or civil. And this qualified immunity, almost as if we're condoning it, almost as if black lives don't matter. And that's why, hopefully with this moment, we can do something to change that.
Thank you, sir. Mayor Morial, part of this bill is a different forum for judging police misconduct, an independent prosecutor to determine if a law enforcement officer may have violated the law in using deadly force or force at all. You've been a mayor of a major city. You helped clean up the New Orleans Police Department when you were there, and that was a tough thing to do. Mm-hmm. How do you feel a provision which we've got in this bill and which Ms. Gupta had in her recommendations to have an independent prosecutor would help restore confidence in the public?
I think it's an essential element. The working relationship between the normal prosecutor, whether it's a state's attorney, a district attorney, at the local level, and the police department is a hand-in-glove relationship. And therefore, the friendships are developed, a working relationship is developed, and it becomes difficult sometimes for local prosecutors to indeed investigate and bring charges against police departments or police officers. In the federal system, you'll find sometimes the same thing, right, where United States attorneys may work very closely with FBI, may work very closely with local law enforcement on joint task forces and strike forces to ferret out crime. So independent prosecutors, I also think it would allow for there to be expertise, teams of investigators that understand these sorts of cases. It's just an idea whose time has come. The record, unfortunately, has been, whether it's in Ferguson with prosecutor McCullough, whether it's been in the Eric Garner case with the Staten Island district attorney, and you could cite numerous examples of just instances where many times these local prosecutors cannot bring themselves to bring charges even when the evidence is clear. So I think this is a reform whose time has come. I think it's a reform that it should not be difficult for people to agree to, and I think it would be a vast improvement over the status quo.
Thank you, sir. With the local prosecutor, you also have the police unions make endorsements, as do the Deputy Sheriff's Association, and they endorse the DA or they don't endorse the DA, and they make contributions as well. So while there's the hand-in-glove relationship and of them being witnesses, and a lot of former officers end up being investigators for the DA, they also have that political problem.
You're absolutely right, Congressman Cohen, and that working relationship is so close and so substantial.
This bill also, that was another bill I had that I worked with Lacey Clay on, and it's part of this bill, is a requirement of a reportage of deadly force incidents. It would help me now. I tried to do some research myself, and maybe y'all can help me. The most egregious civil rights cases I know of are ones where white officers killed black citizens unlawfully. Garner, Floyd, next, shootings, whatever. Other than St. Paul, Minnesota, I didn't see any instances where black officers were alleged to have done the same type of thing. Is it because we don't have statistics to know it, or is there something that says about a systemic racism?
I will say this, we had instances in New Orleans where black officers killed black citizens. I can't think of an instance where a black officer killed one instance where a black officer killed a white citizen. There may be aberrations.
But were those lawful? Was lawful actions?
No, not lawful at all. No, they were acts of misconduct and acts of brutality. But I think, there's a great database that the Washington Post has that pretty much over the last 5 years can give you pretty much chapter and verse on all killings of citizens by police.
Thank you, and I appreciate the balance of my time.
The member yields back. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Floyd and Ms. Jacobs, it took tremendous courage for both of you to come here today when you're still grieving the loss of your brothers. I hope we can honor their memory by enacting meaningful reforms that prevent future senseless acts of violence and begin a healing process that makes us a stronger, more unified nation. I also want to thank the other witnesses for appearing today and helping us to determine what changes ought to be made. We must enact reforms that ensure accountability for police misconduct, not defund or dismantle police departments. I represent the 1st Congressional District of Ohio, which includes most of the city of Cincinnati. Nearly 2 decades ago, in 2001, an African-American young man named Timothy Thomas was fatally shot by a police officer in the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood in Cincinnati. Following protests and civil unrest, unfortunately including rioting, police representatives, community leaders, and city and federal officials entered into something called the Collaborative Agreement with the goal of building a positive, constructive relationship between the Cincinnati Police Department and the neighborhoods that they serve. Reaching the agreement required everyone involved putting aside their political agendas and working together. What did the Collaborative Agreement do? Well, it addressed use of force situations, called for de-escalation training for the police, body cameras, and formed a citizen complaint authority, among other things. Once the framework of the agreement was in place, then Senator Mike DeWine, who's now our governor, then Congressman Rob Portman, who's now in the Senate, and I worked closely together to help secure the federal funding needed to implement its provisions. The results haven't been perfect, but we've seen a dramatic improvement in Cincinnati police-community relations. Trust and goodwill have been restored. Arrests and serious crimes have decreased in Cincinnati. Excessive use of force by police officers has also decreased, as has violence against police officers. Perhaps most importantly, when problems do arise, they're handled in a predominantly civil, respectful manner due to years of cooperation and direct, honest communication between the police and our communities. Given the success we've had in Cincinnati, perhaps the Collaborative Agreement could be the starting point for other cities across the country who need to repair police-community relations. The process required to craft such an agreement can lead to better communication, understanding, and if undertaken seriously, greater respect between all parties involved. Mr. Bongino, I'll start with you if I can. Is this the direction that you think perhaps American cities ought to move towards if they want to improve police-community relations?
I think it's a terrific idea. I can tell you the sheriff in Martin County, where I live and reside now, has made a concerted effort to do outreach before there's a problem. Now, having said that, those collaborations can and do work. The problem I see during my experience as a police officer, or saw, as I should say, back in the late 90s, is you can develop all the relationships you want. They can be very productive and friendly, but if they become omnidirectional, one way, not omnidirectional, but one way instead of bidirectional, you're not going to get anywhere. What I mean by that is if people are afraid to go to those contacts in the police department that they've made and established relationships with because the local drug dealer has them under constant threat and effectively house arrest, you're going to get nothing out of that. Again, let me just be crystal clear. It's a terrific idea. There is nothing but positive externalities to be generated from that. But if you can't establish a framework of safety and security, it's not going to be a bidirectional relationship, and it'll be useless. Citizens have to be able to come forward to the contacts they made knowing they're not going to be attacked or criminalized later on or retaliated against. That security comes first.
Thank you very much. And let me just conclude with this. We need to find a better way to interact as a society, to work with each other and have the police and the communities that they work with actually work together and talk. We need to put aside our differences and listen to each other and focus on those things that unite us rather than divide us. And finally, we owe it to our children and our grandchildren, to the future of this nation, to dedicate ourselves to the principle that all men and all women are created equal. And again, I want to particularly thank Ms. Underwood-Jacobs and Mr. Floyd for being here today, and really all the witnesses. Hopefully, we can have both parties working together to actually accomplish something here and not just point fingers and blame the other side. So let's hope we can do that. And you've helped to bring that together today. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Let me simply note that if members ask questions of remote witnesses, you should mute your mic while the witness answers the question remotely. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this incredibly important hearing.
Use your mic.
Thank you for holding this hearing, and I thank the witnesses for being here to help us forge a new path forward, a path to a place where black men and women cannot be murdered in the streets with impunity by those sworn to protect them. Mr. Floyd, know that we grieve with you and your family on the loss of your brother, and my heartfelt condolences go out to you and to your entire family. And Ms. Underwood-Jacobs, I offer my sincere condolences to you and your family on the loss of your dear brother. Mayor Morial, throughout recent times, we've seen repeated instances where black people, often unarmed, have been killed by a police officer, and if the death results in a use of force investigation, that investigation most often is conducted by the law enforcement agency that employs the officer who used the deadly force. Isn't that correct?
That's traditionally the way it works.
And Professor Butler, we've also witnessed these use of force investigations being overseen by the local district attorney who works hand in hand, day after day, year after year, with the same officer and with the agency that employs the officer who used the deadly force in the case that's under investigation. Isn't that correct? And Attorney Crump, we've seen time and time again that the investigation becomes long and drawn out, and at some point, months or even years later, the local prosecutor takes that case before a secret grand jury, and out of that grand jury usually comes what's called a no bill, which is a refusal to indict the officer who committed the homicide. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir, Congressman Johnson.
And Professor Butler, because grand jury proceedings are secret, the public never learns exactly what the prosecutor presented to the grand jury. Isn't that correct?
Just like the grand jury proceeding in Staten Island with Eric Garner, who was placed in an illegal chokehold, we have no idea why that grand jury didn't indict that officer for murder.
It becomes just another justified killing of a black person by the police in America. Wouldn't it be fairer if the homicide investigation were undertaken by an independent police agency, Attorney Gupta?
I think it would. It would also give the community members much more faith in their legal system if there was an independent investigator in these kinds of cases.
And Attorney Eiffel, wouldn't it be better for the use of force investigation to be overseen by an independent prosecutor?
Without question.
And Professor Butler, wouldn't it inspire public confidence and trust if the law required transparency in the investigation and that the results of the independent investigation be made available to the citizenry within a reasonable period of time, but not 2 years later, like in the Michael Brown case in Ferguson?
Yes, Congressman. When an officer dishonors her badge by committing a crime, she should receive the same process as any other criminal.
Attorney Eiffel, do you believe that the Justice in Policing Act should require the withholding of federal grant funding to police agencies when the states in which they operate do not require independent deadly force investigations overseen by an independent prosecutor and police agency in police use of force, deadly use of force investigations?
I believe there needs to be an entire overhaul of the funding that goes from the federal government through the Department of Justice to local police departments to ensure that they comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits the federal government from giving money to local programs that engage in discrimination. And one way to ensure that this is not discriminatory is to ensure that there are independent investigations of police killings of unarmed Americans, and particularly unarmed African Americans.
Thank you. Last, Attorney Gupta, many police officers are protected from being questioned in use of force investigations because of so-called cooling off periods mandated under state law like in Minnesota or under labor contracts negotiated by police unions like the Fraternal Order of Police. Cooling off periods prohibit investigators from interviewing an accused officer for a period ranging from, say, 48 hours to sometimes as long as 10 days after an incident. They give police officers a chance to learn the facts uncovered in the investigation and also to create their storylines, get their storylines straight. Cooling off periods for police officers can undermine the integrity of investigations into police misconduct. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Is it time for the federal law to mandate restrictions on cooling off periods, as has been mandated by Department of Justice consent decrees with police?
Bring up two different sets of rules for people.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And coming together today, I'm reminded of something this committee has done before, and it goes back to Old Testament Scripture. Says, "Come now, let us reason together." What the Scripture's telling us is that we've been confronted with the problem, and the question is for us is how do we deal with it? We've been confronted with the issue. The question is how do we deal with it? And what's concerning, and as I see this today, and for Mr. Floyd and Ms. Jacobs, the loss and the realness in your body language, in your eyes, and in your voice, is the pain of a nation right now coming to grips with conflicting issues and values in their head, wanting a safe and civil society in which all of us get along, and in a way that should, in a society that we know doesn't. When you see your loved one murdered, when you find out your loved one murdered, in a time in which we're just all struggling. But it is not surprising to this committee. But it's unfortunate for this committee because in the previous Congress, we actually had a police working group in which we went to Houston. Chief Acevedo was there. We worked and we had a good couple of days of meetings. We went to Detroit. We went to Atlanta. We also had meetings here. And we were beginning these conversations, but we didn't continue. When this new Congress set in, we didn't do anything. And now we're here again, faced with a crisis of the moment. And Congress, unfortunately, lives by this seeming decree. Put it off until we have to have a hearing like this, and we mourn the loss of the things most precious to us. My question is really, what can we do? And Ms. Jacobs, you said something earlier. It's talking about communities and jobs. It's about putting our communities together, the policing issue, and someone who is a son of a law enforcement officer. My father was a state trooper. I sympathize with this. I watched it. And one of the most grievous days in my father's ever memory is I remember when one of his own did something horribly wrong and they took him to prison. And it said, and the reason is he come home and I remember him being down and he looked at me and he said, the problem is, he said, everybody thinks I did it. He said, we got to get rid of that. But what have we done? There are things that we can do to help our communities. This committee came together on the First Step Act, on criminal justice reform, sentencing reform, working with the Senate to actually make a difference in our communities, to actually take the president who signed that, who made it a pillar of what he wants to do and sign it. That's what a committee together can do. We've not done that here. We've actually I worked with the late Elijah Cummings, chairman, on the Fair Chance Act. We talk about jobs. Then the Fair Chance Act was giving those with the criminal records a fair shot at applying for jobs because we unchecked the box where they wouldn't have to go through a screening beforehand. Let's see if they can actually set on their own and try a new chance in life. It's about making our communities whole again. And yet there are things in this bill that we can all agree on, but there's things in this bill that I wish we would take a little more time with. That we would just sit back and say, what is this going to happen? We've had task force set up with the Justice Action Network, COVID-19 Emergency Justice Task Force that looked at how we deal with our prison populations. A solicitor from my hometown, Stephanie Woodard, was a part of that. Others have been a part. This is a time for conversations to find good answers without unintended consequences. Ms. Bongino, I have a question for you, and it's been sort of intimated. Are there things about this that concern you? Not that they're not ideas that need to be discussed, but when you look at some of the issues around qualified immunity, some of the micromanagement in this bill, what concerns you when you see this from a law enforcement perspective?
Well, as the great Thomas Sowell says often, it's not what you do, it's asking and then what. Mm-hmm. Listen, I get it. There are serious issues with qualified immunity. Nobody on the panel's wrong, or on the witnesses either, bringing them up. There's no question about that. We're in full agreement. The problem is, if you were to repeal qualified immunity, have you considered and then what? Have you considered the fact that police officers' legal bills, some who may in fact deserve it for doing an awful job, but some who may not, will be so oppressive that you won't have police officers? Have you considered the fact that some of these police officers, out of fear of the rather litigious society we live in now, unfortunately, will now be afraid in the street to go and do their jobs and be proactive in communities that need it most? I mean, has anybody asked that question? Or are we just gaffing that off to create an interesting soundbite? The then what matters here, folks. Qualified immunity has issues. You can work around the edges, but the margins matter here.
And I think what we're bringing up here is not an issue that we don't need to discuss. And when we were discussing this through our police working group, we went to these communities, and I appreciate what you said, that it has to go both ways. The community and the police have to have these conversations both ways. I'm concerned here, and I appreciate that concern, because this is heading to where I know it always heads here. This is the hearing. Next week we mark up a bill. Next week it goes to the floor. Then we hope the Senate does something, and then we sort of go back and forth and hope that it gets right. My hope is that, Mr. Chairman, we get this right. We did it before. Let's make it happen again and take the comments of these committees on both sides. Mr. Crump and everybody, we can work on this. I've done it before. This committee has a history of working together. Let's do this, and let's get with the President and the Senate and make a difference so that lives are valued.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Underwood-Jacobs, I'm sorry for your loss. Mr. Floyd, I'm sorry for your loss. We're here today because of the long and growing list of black Americans whose lives were taken from us prematurely at the hands of police. That's why we're here. George Floyd is the latest. Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, and far, far too many others. We're here today to keep this list from getting even one name longer. In this moment, we must dedicate and rededicate ourselves to working toward a more just and inclusive country. The violence and disregard for human life is what people were sickened by when they saw that awful video, Mr. Floyd. The fact that so many have marched representing the true diversity of our country, led by young people, all in the face of a pandemic, to speak out for others, shows just how tired our nation, our entire nation, all of us are of seeing black person after black person killed by the police. The thousands and thousands of peaceful protesters across this nation deserve our attention. They deserve action, and the Justice in Policing Act is comprehensive reform that tackles the scourge of police brutality that has plagued communities of color year after year. Brutality that undermines and tarnishes the invaluable contributions of the honorable law enforcement officers who are just as heartsick as the rest of us at this problem. What we saw in the video of George Floyd's murder was the complete indifference to pain. Mr. Floyd was experiencing pain, and it was in need better data collection on police misconduct and use of force. We need fair and thorough investigations by DOJ's Civil Rights Division that starts by giving them subpoena power to investigate allegations of police misconduct. And we need to know that police officers who violate the civil rights of black Americans can be held accountable for their actions in a court of law. For Breonna Taylor, who was shot in her own home while the actual suspects the police were looking for were in police custody, we need to end the practice of no-knock warrants. For Sandra Bland, who was found dead in a jail cell 3 days after being stopped for a minor traffic violation, and for Philando Castile, who was shot 5 times while seated in his car during a traffic stop, we need to require police officers to wear body cameras and require police vehicles to use dashboard cameras. For Tamir Rice, a child who was shot by police while playing in a park with a toy gun, we need to help communities reform public safety and change the culture of law enforcement. And for Eric Garner, and yes, Philanese, for your brother George, we need to outlaw chokeholds. The Justice in Policing Act does all of this. It will provide accountability. It will provide transparency. And for our witnesses, I'd like to focus on what happens when troubled officers leave or are fired by one agency, then move to another, a system where police officers evade sanctions simply by moving jobs. We don't accept this for doctors who care for us. We don't accept this for lawyers who defend us. And we shouldn't accept this for officers who protect us. So the question I have with respect to Tamir Rice's killing by an officer who, as we heard earlier, lost his previous job as a police officer in a nearby suburb of Cleveland, was deemed emotionally unstable, an unstable recruit and unfit for duty. Ms. Gupta, what would a newly imagined registry that would require the law enforcement agency to report the finding of the officer's fitness for duty look like in that scenario?
Well, if there was a registry of the kind that the Justice in Policing Act it recommends, you'd have a national registry of all federal, state, and local law enforcement agents that would record misconduct complaints, discipline termination records, records of certification. It would be conditioned if law enforcement agencies would need to put those inputs in order to get some federal funding. And the registry has to be public. And in the case of Tamir Rice, I will tell you, not just in Tamir Rice's case, but in many of the cases, I remember Justice Department civil rights prosecutors upset that they didn't have access to that kind of information in order not only for prosecutions, but also police chiefs. And Chief Acevedo just spoke to this earlier about the importance for chiefs to also have that kind of information available in making hiring decisions and the like. It protects the community.
Mr. Chairman, this is our civil rights moment. I pray that our committee and this body will rise to meet that moment.
We all agree. Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. George Floyd's death was senseless and tragic. I grieve for the Floyd family and look forward to justice being served. My heart also goes out to the family of Patrick Underwood, and I thank both of you for being here under these difficult circumstances. Yes, there are a few officers who are attracted to the uniform for the wrong reasons, who want the authority of carrying a badge and a gun but can't handle the responsibility. Some have anger issues, some mental health issues. But the bad cops are an extremely small percentage of the police officers in this country. And there's another side of the story. For 25 years, I prosecuted criminals working closely with great police officers and federal agents. Yes, I prosecuted and convicted some officers. But I also was at the bedside of officers after they had been shot trying to help someone. I've attended funerals for officers killed because they had the courage to wear the badge and do their job. I've been in the hospital trying to comfort one of my employees who learned just moments before of the death of her husband a sheriff's deputy killed in the line of duty. Don't blame the police. It takes a special kind of courage to protect those who can't protect themselves, who care so much for their community they are willing to risk their lives to save others. When there is gunfire, violence, conflict, a few brave men and women wearing blue uniforms run toward the danger while others run away. Don't blame the police because they didn't create the policies that cause crime. And we all know the root causes of crime. Some don't like to admit their role in the breakdown of our society, but the people watching this hearing know. We commit a grave injustice to those who have died at the hands of police and those who have died at the hands of violent criminals if we don't deal with the root causes of crime.